Ernest Cline emerges as a walking archive of popular culture, someone who can pinpoint every cultural marker of a given moment, especially those that define the 1980s across music, style, film, and television, with an encyclopedic sense of where all those touchstones lie. References to the decade surface in overlapping fragments. Mentions of John Hughes, Chuck E. Cheese, and Ferris Bueller appear, along with expressions of fondness for how things used to be and an evident obsession with all things 80s repeated like a kind of chant. The book in question centers on the pop culture of the 1980s, framed as the most formative decade because it marked the author's adolescence. It also brought a first video game console and a first home computer, marking the first time a dial-up connection linked one computer to another and allowed text conversation with another person. A VCR acquired during that decade unlocked access to the entire history of world cinema, beyond whatever played on television or in a local theater, and these combined experiences supplied the motivation for focusing creative attention on that era. A ritual surfaces involving opening a can of Tab, putting on Duran Duran, and playing the arcade game Robotron, offered as an explanation for an affection for the fictional Oasis. The underlying story is called Fantastic, likened to a dream narrative that resonates especially with anyone of the same generation. The era comes across as a genuinely good time, with video games portrayed as fantastic and an identity rooted in arcade culture, including fond memories of visiting arcades to play. The Atari 2600 and its cartridges, plugged into a television set, surface in the conversation, along with a lighthearted exchange about a father declining to buy one and instead purchasing a cheaper imitation. Reading the book feels like having someone reach directly into personal memory and pull out references spanning MTV, comic books, movies, and television shows. A particular fondness comes through for any program involving robots, computer hackers, or technology, citing shows like WizKids, Knight Rider, and Airwolf, alongside a strong attachment to super vehicle series such as Street Hawk, essentially Knight Rider on a motorcycle, with watching Knight Rider likened to a full-time occupation. Every decade carries moments that later feel embarrassing, yet the 1980s stands apart as a seminal decade expected to be regarded kindly by history and remembered as a particularly creative time. A question arises about dressing in an outfit inspired by a favorite film, prompting an acknowledgement that most favorite movies trace back to the 1980s, cast as the crucial formative years. Naming a single favorite film or band from the decade proves difficult given a broad love for the entire era, including the Star Wars films and George Lucas's work, which carry deep personal meaning alongside numerous Amblin productions not directed by Spielberg. The Back to the Future films and their sequels register as hugely significant, along with a fondness for Gremlins, culminating in the discovery of a Gizmo figure tucked into the corner of an old shipping container. Spielberg's films left a major personal impact, including a deep love for the Indiana Jones series and repeated theater viewings of E.T. A costume comes together piece by piece, combining a red Elliot-style hoodie with a full Chunk from Goonies look, complete with a truffle shuffle, plaid pants, and a surprised reaction to a pair of shoes identified as replicas from Back to the Future Part 2, with encouragement to fully commit to the look. Signs of directorial inspiration run throughout the story, including a character's Grail diary of collected clues explicitly tied to Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. A favorite in-story racing game turns out to be a nod to an arcade cabinet once kept at Amblin, with a documentary reportedly showing gameplay from that era, met with amusement and agreement. News that Spielberg had interest in directing the film adaptation produced outright awe, with the situation still feeling surreal even after the fact. Personal elements surface across a body of produced and directed films within the source book, alongside an early internal decision against making a film that both celebrates the 1980s and centers on self-celebration. A compromise allowed for only one or two references to personal films, with most self-referential material ultimately cut from the finished project. An initial assumption that the story would resonate mainly with an audience of the same generation, nostalgic for the late 1970s and 1980s, turned out to be incorrect, since cultural touchstones once thought distinctly American ended up resonating internationally. What began as an account of personal childhood experience grew into a reflection of experience shared widely across audiences. The question of where to begin came up, along with how to start making the film and what the first step should be. The production ranks among the hardest ever undertaken, since it did not simply involve taking a crew out to film, but instead required many iterations and numerous technological layers to realize both the virtual oasis and the real world. Technology, it was noted, served only to serve the story better, with an aim for the technology itself to disappear so that focus stayed on the story and the characters. An actor received direction to deliver the line establishing the character's identity as Parzival, first to the key. Before the project arrived, the novel Ready Player One was unfamiliar. It was brought forward by Warner Brothers, along with a script credited to Ernest Cline and Zach Penn. Reading the script first sparked a strong, immediate enthusiasm, driven by the audacious concept of two intertwined worlds, virtual and real posed, as a choice for future generations. Reading the book afterward proved even more absorbing, with its depth and layering cited as what sealed a deep interest in pursuing the project. The book's origin traces to the Atari game Adventure, historically significant as the first video game to contain a hidden Easter egg, created secretly by designer Warren Robinett. Discovering that game at a young age marked a formative experience of finding something hidden inside a virtual world. A childhood fondness for Roald Dahl, particularly the Willy Wonka stories, combined with that memory to spark the idea of a video game designer holding a contest inside his own greatest creation, echoing Wonka's golden ticket premise. This fusion of ideas led to imagining an eccentric billionaire designer leaving behind riddles built from his own passion's favorite films, songs, and characters as clues for a worthy successor. Those passions included a fondness for Hot Pockets, Chuck E. Cheese, Video Killed the Radio Star by the Buggles, and the video for Take On Me by Aha. The book's title, Ready Player One, drew inspiration from classic arcade machines, which once displayed that phrase as the final message before a player was immersed in a game's world, a signal that another world was about to begin. In early 2010, a draft manuscript circulated, which was found fantastic. A search for a literary agent followed, and the manuscript was shopped to publishers by June of that year, triggering a major bidding war, with universal enthusiasm from those who read it. Publishing rights sold to Random House in the US, and the book was subsequently taken to movie studios, where Warner Brothers expressed strong interest, leading to a producing partnership formed to develop the film adaptation. The story's blend of technology and character work drew comparisons to classic science fiction by authors such as Arthur C. Clarke and Heinlein, admired since childhood for similar character-driven storytelling. Upon publication in August 2011, the book's reception proved astounding, drawing highly positive early reviews and steadily building a devoted readership. It became a New York Times hardcover bestseller and, the following summer, a paperback bestseller as well, its audience growing largely through word of mouth until it reached bestseller status worldwide, eventually published in over 40 countries and more than 30 languages. A director came aboard in the spring of 2015, serving both as filmmaker and lead producing partner, joined by a producing partner from Amblin for what became a 6-year journey. The concept of the Oasis offered a form of social empowerment, a place to be anyone and do anything, while still operating under governing rules, akin to laws in the real world. This digital frontier resembled the lawless old town of Tombstone before order was imposed, framed as a new Old West, offering hope of a world people might someday choose to inhabit. Adapting the sprawling novel into a 2-hour film required careful selection of material, with a script devised to compress the book's density into a workable narrative. The screenplay drafts were reportedly written even before the novel's publication, and a prior connection existed with the source author through an unrelated documentary about excavating buried video game cartridges in the desert. Initial reluctance to take on the project stemmed from its perceived unmakeable scale, though repeated persistence eventually led to acceptance. Close collaboration followed, marked by frequent calls to check that adaptation choices remained faithful to fans' expectations. Respect for the book and its fan base carried through the writing process, working carefully to extract just the right narrative elements from the source material's dense imagination. Reading the completed script, after seeing what had been developed, prompted a feeling of being fortunate, since although many elements were rearranged and combined, the heart, themes, and central ideas of the original story remained intact, delivered in a cinematic and engaging form. Any concerns fans might raise were met with reassurance that faith in the adaptation had existed since the director signed on, likened to fated destiny. Every new element introduced into the film, even those absent from the book, carried some adaptation or echo of a moment from the source material, ensuring the book's spirit accurately carried through. Casting the ensemble known as the High Five posed a distinctive challenge because the leads were mostly young, between 18 and 20 years old, meaning established stars were not an option since none had yet reached that stage of their careers. Casting decisions relied on intuition rather than calculation, recognized only upon seeing the right person audition, even if that person diverged from how a role was originally written, so long as they could elevate the character beyond the page. Working with young actors with limited screen experience ranked among the most enjoyable aspects of casting. Several cast members recounted learning about an open online casting call promising a role in a major Spielberg production, initially auditioning for the roles of Wade, Daito, and Shoto without knowing many details, given how tightly the script was guarded. One account described getting a callback about the film, laughing in disbelief, and staying cautious about expectations. Another actor described being part of a Japanese boy band before auditioning in Los Angeles and meeting the director for the first time, admitting to nervousness so strong that specifics of the audition were barely remembered. Another actor described auditioning first in New York, then being flown to Los Angeles for chemistry reads, before eventually receiving the surreal news of being cast. The central role of Wade Watts called for someone relatable, a bit unsure and awkward, and the search for the right actor took considerable time before the eventual lead was found. That performer described a pre-existing obsession with virtual reality before even learning of the project, followed by a self-tape audition, an initial rejection signal suggesting a different type was being sought, and then a surprising second callback for a lighter, more playful take that ultimately succeeded. A co-star recalled meeting this actor during a later round of auditions and noting an unusual calm and charm beyond his years. Reflections on early meetings with the director described warmth and personal connection through shared love of earlier films, alongside amazement at simply being part of the casting process regardless of outcome. Learning of securing the lead role brought overwhelming emotion and a call home to share the news, followed by a sleepless night marked by the sudden realization of the project's scale. Another actor described being drawn to the story's underlying commentary on technology as both a gift and a curse, connecting people while simultaneously pulling them apart, which only heightened excitement to begin work. A cast member recalled early disbelief at the scope of a Hollywood production, tempered by the growing sense that it was, in fact, reality. The camaraderie among the ensemble came up repeatedly, each member bringing something unique despite differing backgrounds, united by a shared passion that made the work feel effortless and enjoyable rather than laborious. The production and costume design teams faced the challenge of essentially designing two separate films for two separate worlds. This process nearly doubled the creative workload, requiring constant negotiation between practical, lived-in real-world detail and boundless virtual invention. One collaborator brought experience from years of highly stylized filmmaking, translating that visual rigor into the project. Early creative conversations focused on defining the tone of the real world, how post-apocalyptic it should feel, which then set the contrasting stage for a vividly saturated virtual oasis. Visual effects teams collaborated closely to determine how such contrasts, especially in color and intensity, would be rendered on screen. A costume designer who had previously collaborated on an earlier historical drama admitted having never before designed for a genre like this one, yet delivered striking conceptual work covering everything from hard suits and faction uniforms to full avatar wardrobes. Extensive research went into imagining fashion, technology, and medical science several decades into the future, building a rich design vocabulary from which every subsequent choice was drawn. Close coordination between production design and costume teams helped establish the visual grounding for this imagined future, guided at every step by directorial input. Designing lead characters' avatars unfolded as a layered process, starting from a single striking image, then expanding into full 360-degree detail, followed by consideration of movement, voice, and how an actor's physical performance would translate into a digital counterpart. Designs for two supporting characters were settled early and remained largely consistent, while the design of others, including the female lead, went through many more iterations. One male hero's persona blended two iconic action archetypes, combining massive physical presence with a part human, part machine aesthetic. The female lead's avatar design intentionally echoed classic action heroines and 80s punk rebellion, resulting in a distinct visual identity that resonated strongly with the director. The actress portraying that character noted she lacked personal artistic instincts, but appreciated how the design still preserved a strong resemblance between the character's real and virtual selves, adjusted only slightly for cinematic clarity. A significant amount of design work went into an elaborate opening race sequence set in a heightened, dreamlike version of New York City, part actual metropolis, part homage to 80s cinema, and part video game racetrack, combining a spinning Manhattan bridge, shifting streets, and a chaotic pinball-like structure throughout. A dance club known as the Distracted Globe, built around a zero-gravity concept, proved especially difficult to design because a purely spherical space made every camera angle look identical. The solution involved introducing partial gravity so visitors could first orient themselves before leaping into a weightless zone. That environment hosted a key dance sequence for two central characters, awash in defining neon yellow and pink, echoing the angular haircuts and exaggerated 80s silhouettes, padded shoulders, cinched waists, used throughout the design language. One designer described an initial reluctance toward reviving the era's aesthetic that quickly turned into genuine enthusiasm for its boldness and pattern experimentation, later linked to a personal fondness for vintage band merchandise. Reflection on the sheer number of highly designed environments, corporate stacks, business towers, faction headquarters, marketplace stalls, underscores the scale of visual planning required, extending even to a brief but fully costumed sequence set in a Hong Kong office populated by dozens of extras alongside detailed haptic gear worn by the central group. A large design team based in London proved essential to executing a production of this scale. Advances in flexible synthetic materials, unavailable only a year earlier, opened new possibilities in costume construction. Extensive thought also went into imagining futuristic haptic technology, informed by emerging medical devices that already merge electronic function with the human body. Enthusiasm for creative suggestions during filming met with encouragement to try new ideas on set, fostering a collaborative environment in which no contribution felt wasted. One performer described a pivotal emotional beat as representing everything their character stood for, clashing directly with everything the antagonist represented. The director came across as deeply engaged with actors, willing to explore alternate line deliveries and blocking until a scene felt right, always maintaining an encouraging, upbeat presence that kept the cast motivated through long, exhausting days. Enthusiastic reactions to successful takes were common, often marked by visible excitement and immediate calls to print the footage, while less successful takes were reworked patiently until everyone felt satisfied. This supportive dynamic built deep trust, with confidence that guidance would always steer performances in the right direction. A sequence inspired by The Shining stood out as a favorite addition, notable because it was not part of the original novel, despite other references to the same director appearing there. Contributing ideas to that sequence felt like an honor, rooted in deep admiration for that director's body of work, including his earlier collaboration on another beloved film. Recreating specific shots from The Shining digitally, rather than physically rebuilding original sets, posed a technical challenge grounded in wanting audiences to feel as though they were truly inside that earlier film. A personal connection to horror fiction also surfaced, including an author photo styled as a direct homage to a famous image from Stephen King's back cover, swapping a classic car for a DeLorean, reflecting an admiration for both horror auteurs whose styles collided within this sequence. Twin performers were cast to exactly replicate the iconic imagery from the original film, with painstaking attention paid to matching every visual detail, down to fabric and hair ribbons. Several cast members admitted discomfort with horror as a genre, noting that one character's fear of the sequence mirrored their own real apprehension, allowing a naturally vulnerable performance despite otherwise portraying an imposing, muscular character. Certain sequences demanded extensive rehearsal because a stunt or effect could only be executed once, requiring precise timing cues for actions such as backing away, turning, and falling as structures collapsed nearby, accompanied by real anxiety about making a mistake during the single take. After a successful take involving a large explosion, cheers and gratitude spread among the crew, with lighthearted banter about it being an early standout moment in a young performer's career. At a later gathering, appreciation went out for the extraordinary effort and support shown throughout the demanding shoot, acknowledging that this was no ordinary production, but one as layered as a wedding cake, with hope that all the work would ultimately come together successfully. The experience ranked as the most challenging undertaking in memory, made worthwhile by being surrounded by a talented, gifted young cast alongside a devoted longtime crew, some of whom had worked together since the early 1990s. Heartfelt thanks went out to everyone involved for bringing the project to completion, closing with a toast to the finished film amid cheers and applause. A virtual world was under construction, but it could not resemble a cartoon. It needed to look almost as realistic as the real world, while retaining just enough of a difference so that an audience could tell when the story had shifted into a digital universe, as opposed to the usual experience of watching a film shot on location. Achieving that balance proved difficult, in fact, very difficult. The Oasis represents a place where the only limits on reality are imagination. The sheer scale of the project stands out as extraordinary, given the number of individual characters and the complexity of the scenes involved, a scale considered almost overwhelming. Inside the Oasis, every single element had to be created from scratch, since almost nothing could simply be treated as a found object. Every aspect that would appear in that world required careful thought design and illustration, and the visual effects wove directly into how the story and its characters exist. Collaboration took place with teams from ILM and Digital Domain on how to visualize and present that world from the very beginning of production. During pre-production, a staggering amount of artwork emerged, with ILM's art department heavily involved from the earliest stages. One artist rose to become the art director of virtual production, working alongside the production designer and other concept artists to generate ideas for characters, vehicles, and set pieces. That early conceptual work gave way to the virtual production phase, where a team from Digital Domain joined early to assist in the design process using VR as a kind of tech scouting tool. Concept art supplied by ILM and the production designer provided a foundation to build from, and every character, prop, vehicle, and environment was brought into VR so the director could put on a headset and walk through the sets directly. A stairway set was walked through virtually, with a lower area rising up to reveal itself, since every set was constructed virtually first. A virtual camera traveled with the avatar inside these environments, allowing either video recording of walkthroughs or the capture of frame grabs on demand. Suggestions were floated for how the floor of a set might rise like a chute, illustrating how an idea for a scene could be proposed and then extended multiple times over. An artist positioned nearby could adjust and shift elements in real time, with continual small adjustments made throughout the process until the exact look being sought was achieved. Extensive pre-visualization functioned like storyboards taken a step further through motion before the film moved into its shooting phase. Complicated sequences were built and designed together with the director, who supplied the overall concept while leaving the technical mechanics to be worked out by the effects team. Guidance covered camera placement, such as lining up wheels with a ramp or dollying from a shoulder down to tires, and once elements are seen in motion, perceptions of the sequence change considerably. Performance capture covered the entire film, with performances then placed into the appropriate environment to form what was called a master scene. A real-time composite of the live-action plate and the digital plate could be viewed simultaneously, allowing a camera operator to see the digital characters directly on the monitor, hear the accompanying sound, and shoot naturally as though filming a live scene. Over 6 weeks of virtual camera shooting, thousands of individual shots were captured. Instructions called for widening a shot while moving in closer, and a take was marked to be saved and printed. The division of labor on the project worked effectively, with ILM handling all Oasis content while the other team managed live-action, real-world material. One key early moment required establishing how the introduction into the virtual world would be visually conveyed. A close, point-of-view-driven camera move was requested, intended to carry a psychological sense of transition from the real world into the Oasis. An actor was filmed alone against a blue screen using specialized camera gear capable of getting extremely close to the face before moving past it and into a set of goggles. Since practical filming could only achieve so much, a digital double eventually took over. The actor entered a face-scanning rig that captured highly detailed photographs of skin texture and hair, and the face was laser-mapped to combine structural data with these details, applying it to the character in the real world. Extensive work went into matching the look, lighting, and texture so that the transition between the two versions appeared seamless. A large number of real-world effects were handled by the effects team, including computer screens and three-dimensional HUD technology, with every effect contained within a 360-degree mask. Another significant element involved a high-tech boot suit, a combination of costume design and visual effects built to suggest muscular capability, able to squeeze the skin beneath it and provide force feedback. The suit was later digitally replaced in post-production so that it could be lit properly, a process complicated by additional gas simulations used to make it appear to grip the body. Touch effects had to be synchronized precisely with corresponding actions happening inside the Oasis so that cutting between the two settings remained consistent. One of the most notable effects involved a hologram used to project a character into the real world. Since audiences already carry expectations about how holograms look on screen, an effort was made to avoid a derivative depiction. A proposal called for the hologram to be made of light while still retaining some physical attributes and momentum of the real performer. An elaborate, physically accurate particle system constantly broke apart and reformed, conveying the sense that the projection was being continuously rebuilt. A character's birth took place in 2027, creating convincing detail extended beyond what was directly in front of the camera to include material deep in the background, requiring constant effort to avoid repetition between foreground and background elements. 6 large structures, each up to 4 stories tall, were physically built on location, with a wide lens revealing the surrounding countryside where filming took place. Since the story called for structures far taller and more numerous than what was built, extensive additional geometry had to be created to populate a vast horizon of similar buildings. Between takes, extensive photographic reference of the practical sets was gathered to closely match the digital extensions to the physical work. Care was taken to avoid repetitive detail across a large area meant to appear cluttered, so variations in models and textures ensured no two elements looked identical. Because windows had been removed on set to avoid reflections of the camera crew, they later had to be digitally reinserted along with realistic reflections of the surrounding environment, reinforcing a sense of a fully real world extending both near and far from the camera. Structures were rigged practically to explode, with the effects team later extending and expanding those explosions beyond what practical stunts alone could achieve, adding debris and collapsing metal to convey the destruction of an entire structure. Correct physics and dynamic simulation ensured that all moving elements carried believable weight and collided convincingly. Wide shots generally involved visual effects, with set extensions matching what had been physically built. In a large war room scene, only a handful of live performers were positioned nearest the camera, so a virtual production crew captured additional walking and acting performances that populated the rest of the space with hundreds of digital figures. Close collaboration with ILM began in the earliest stages of design, extending even to the construction of the main characters, with an initial base built before being finished by ILM. Finalizing the character designs required considerable time and effort, and no amount of advanced rendering or simulation would succeed without the director making a genuine emotional connection to a character on screen. Getting the avatars' faces to a convincing level of detail proved difficult, aiming for close-ups indistinguishable from real actors, while allowing wider shots to appear slightly more virtual, helping distinguish between worlds. Extensive coordination took place among animation teams handling overall physical action and facial performance, supported by a separate group focused solely on refining facial nuance for consistency and emotional accuracy. Every facial performance underwent individual review with the director to examine subtle character choices in each moment. A brief exchange about arriving somewhere ahead of another character came up, followed by discussion of how virtual avatars are driven by real performers, and how finding a distinguishing trait from each actor helped audiences connect emotionally with the characters. For one character, the eyes proved key, and only when they were remodeled closer to the original performer's eyes did that character's performance fully come together. A brief quotation attributed to a favorite fictional character appears within the story, concerning how differently people interpret information. Designing another central character proved challenging due to exaggerated features, particularly large eyes that could appear strange from certain angles if not carefully controlled. For a time, the character's performance was not resonating fully with the director until the actress's own mouth shape was integrated into the avatar, after which the personality and performance mapped much more convincingly. Playful banter, referencing pop culture vehicles, found its way in, alongside praise for working with a large-scale on-screen character performed by an actress whose movement qualities needed to remain recognizable despite the character's much bigger stature, all while preserving a disguised gender beneath its exterior. The character's design combined hydraulic part styling with influences from a rhinoceros's thick skin and manta ray patterning on the head. Lighting carried critical importance. Technically flawless shots without a clear point of view or personality in the lighting counted as unsuccessful. Virtual world lighting developed collaboratively over roughly 2 years of post-production, aiming to reflect the psychology of each scene and the emotional state of characters, including a nighttime sequence built around harsh searchlights resembling a prison yard, with strong lens flares creating high contrast that was praised for its cinematic quality. Many animated films tend to light characters mainly while they speak, but achieving that same clarity in a live-action approach proved impossible, resulting in frequent passages of visual darkness. As the choice was made to light the film like a live-action production, many lights that would otherwise be used were stripped away, leading to faces going dark at times, a striking departure from typical digital film lighting. A whispered instruction referencing a giant robotic figure made its way into the script, tied to the excitement of bringing beloved cinematic artifacts back to the screen. Extensive clearance work was required throughout, since nearly every element referenced existing intellectual property, necessitating detailed tracking lists of every reference used. Recreating details such as steam burst from a time-traveling car, its time circuits, and its flux capacitor proved rewarding, as the entire crew contributed pieces to the effort. A race sequence ranked among the earliest concepts developed and one of the very last completed, complex enough to feel like its own film. Camera work throughout retained realistic shake and movement, mirroring how such scenes would be filmed practically, a quality the director insisted on to preserve grounded realism, even as this world's grit blended with what was fundamentally a large-scale video game. Advantage was taken of the setting being a constructed world, transitioning abruptly from a busy financial district in daylight to a nighttime chase through a dinosaur-filled cityscape, a juxtaposition considered simply exciting and appropriate for a game-like world. A memorable venue got referenced as a well-known dance club, leading into praise for a favorite sequence set inside a zero-gravity nightclub, where characters danced without gravity by launching themselves from pads into the air. A brief exchange about partnering up for a first leap, with a denial of forming alliances, accompanied the moment. To capture the choreography, dancers and a trapeze performer were wired up and lifted off the ground for motion capture, giving animators a realistic starting point for the airborne performances. A clue referencing a creator who despises their own creation resurfaced, tied to an homage to a famous horror film that was considered a risky choice but ultimately successful. Recreating that film's camera work frame by frame and rebuilding its sets piece by piece resulted in what was regarded as one of the most convincing virtual environments achieved, closely matching the original. A familiar greeting and an eerie invitation to play were exchanged, alongside a frightened plea about finding an exit, reflecting how an unfamiliar character's terror mirrored how many people might react if suddenly placed into that world, allowing the sequence to both frighten the audience and provide comedic beats as the character navigated a film he had never seen. A challenge was posed about willingness to risk everything for the oasis and to fight for it. The climactic battle demanded an enormous number of avatars, ranking among the largest undertakings in scale encountered, requiring extensive performance capture of running and fighting. Each faction carried a distinct visual identity and fighting style, supported by a crowd system capable of incorporating many different animation styles, giving the director the ability to direct specific behaviors even within crowds of 500,000 characters, down to particular groups performing coordinated actions. Cameras were designed to move continuously through this chaotic environment, following one figure after another and climbing onto a giant robotic character in a single uninterrupted shot, a sequence remarkable both for its conception and for the challenge of embedding enormous detail while keeping the action readable. A closing exchange expressed mutual honor between collaborators. Working with this director felt like something anyone in the industry would want, given his mastery across every aspect of filmmaking. Filmmaking overall sits at the intersection of creative storytelling and technology, with this project setting a new standard in both respects, called the most unapologetically creative undertaking encountered, with each new project raising the bar further, this one being no exception. Upon signing on to the film, Steven Spielberg stated that sound design would be everything, meaning direction needed to be established early and work needed to begin right away, leading to Gary Rydstrom's involvement. The team of sound designers produced remarkable, heavily layered work, turning the movie into not just a visual feast, but an audible one as well. In initial conversations about the project, the guiding word settled on was fun, reflecting the idea that a game's purpose is for those inside it to enjoy themselves. This single-word principle served as the guiding philosophy for the whole production. Extensive discussions weighed the intent behind the source novel, considering whether the game world should feel completely indistinguishable from reality, or whether something subtly different, sound-wise, should set it apart. Work on a certain character's voice began even before other cast members joined the production. The actress portraying the role brought humor to the part and performed all lines on set, and a test determined whether the voice should be artificially deepened or left natural. Testing ultimately confirmed that the natural voice worked best, since more personality and humor came through without a fake vocal disguise. Adopting an artificial voice would have stripped away that character, and this choice made the sound work more difficult, since achieving the impression of a 9-foot-tall figure required lowering the pitch considerably. Working within a 5 to 10% pitch shift is typical for such effects, but taking the voice down by around 25% counted as an extreme, almost insane adjustment. Considerable time went into handcrafting the voice, so audiences would immediately recognize the character as a 9-foot-tall figure upon hearing it, yet still register the connection when the same voice appeared as another character in the real world. Establishing that link mattered above all else. Much of the enjoyment in crafting the film's sounds came from researching how effects were originally achieved. A certain vehicle performs different actions in this film than in its earlier cinematic appearance, so the original sounds could not simply be reused, making recreation an especially fun challenge. The steam shooting from the vehicle's exhaust vents upon its first appearance had originally been created using a CO2 fire extinguisher, prompting a trip to retrieve one for the new production. Staying true to that original technique made recreating the classic sound both accurate and enjoyable. As with many great scenes crafted across Spielberg's films over the years, this race sequence featured no music at all, relying entirely on sound effects to feel intensely photorealistic and to convey the danger of being inside a real race. Then something impossible in reality unfolds. The road bends, a giant creature appears, and people burst into coins, yet the scene still retains the tension of a genuine race despite its strangeness. Old dinosaur audio files were revisited to create stomping and vocal sounds for part of the sequence. Given how large and complicated the action became, one key task in sound work involved directing audience attention, keeping focus on either the time-traveling car or a character's bike, modeled after a famous anime motorcycle, as the scene developed gradually. A certain sequence marks the moment the heroine truly shines, and the decision was made to make that the central focus of the whole scene, concentrating attention on her protecting the male lead. Her weapon draws from Ripley's pulse rifle from Aliens, while his echoes a colonial revolver from the original Battlestar Galactica, with each weapon designed to sound distinct from the other. An item purchased earlier reverses time. When time runs backwards, the soundtrack drops to its lowest possible frequency and plays in reverse. Lasers appear to travel back into the guns, jetpacks move in reverse, and doors close backwards, an effect that only works in a story built around a world of non-reality. Drone sounds proved especially fun to create, achieved by weighing the devices down or otherwise preventing free flight so the motors strained rather than flew normally, giving the drones an angry, growling quality. That growl ultimately became the signature sound representing the antagonists in the real world. A certain explosion sequence stood out as especially well set up, since the ordinary ambient sounds of that environment were designed to feel constantly teetering and unstable, so that by the time the explosion occurs, a sense of precariousness is already present from the very first bang. A distinct creaking sound was requested for the moment a structure twists before collapsing, echoing favorite creaking sounds used years earlier for a ship's disintegration in an earlier film. This project involved more time on a mixing stage than had been spent in years, with new sounds invented daily to provide audiences with maximum immersion. Such a wide variety of distinct sounds appeared throughout the film that no small set of effects could simply be reused across scenes. Instead, each scene demanded fresh reconsideration of everything that needed to be created. The world depicted is intentionally distinct from real life, creating a philosophical difference for action scenes set in an environment where anything can happen. Blending different sounds together into scenes unique to this particular experience was ultimately what made the work enjoyable. It is noted that John Williams typically composes the vast majority of the films involved, but in this instance, Williams was needed for The Post, which made him unavailable for Ready Player One. A prior collaboration had taken place with Alan Silvestri as an executive producer on all three Back to the Future movies, as well as What Lies Beneath and Castaway, all directed by Robert Zemeckis. The only composer, aside from Williams, considered capable of pulling off a project like Ready Player One turned out to be Silvestri, and it was fortunate that a small window of availability allowed the score to be completed, resulting in a fantastic outcome. An account is given of meeting Steven many years earlier but never having collaborated in this particular way, a thrilling event by any measure. From the very first conversation, a sense of ease took hold, and an invitation into the process followed, regarded as fantastic. By the time of the first meeting, the spotting of the film had already been determined, with music cues mapped out cue by cue from beginning to end, so the direction was clearly understood. Many places required a very specific approach, such as a cue where Samantha is arrested, a passage considered difficult because it needed a sense of lightness, while ensuring the antagonist still felt bad and believable, requiring some very clear tonal decisions. A scene plays in which a debt collection service announces that outstanding debt, exceeding 23,000 credits, has been purchased and consolidated. Moments of creative freedom followed, allowing ideas to simply be tried, and the process overall comes across as incredibly collaborative. A working session unfolds, with discussion of timing adjustments, moving material closer to a reference line, and adding 2 beats into bar 146. One of the great challenges identified is that the story is told in the present about a future time that itself references the 1980s, prompting moments where a very direct approach was wanted. A comment surfaces about an object being called the Zemeckis Cube, expressing a desire to own one. An instance is recalled in which the direction given for one scene was that it should not sound like Back to the Future, but rather feel like it. Material originally written with half-note triplets, described rhythmically as repeated short beats, is noted as never having been played together before, followed by a claim that the issue had now been fixed. The overall narrative and story demanded their own distinct voice, something tonally different that ultimately worked itself out through the process. Regarding the entrance into the oasis, the scene was described using the word religioso, with a desire for choir, prompting uncertainty about how to approach it and a feeling of being terrified before ultimately figuring it out. An idea developed around a place in the film where two characters read a second clue, referencing lines about retracing steps, escaping the past, and a creator who hates his own creation. A conversation over lunch is recalled in which the Latin phrase for Easter egg was sought, arriving at ovum patris tui, regarded as a cool discovery. That phrase became the basis for an entire opening piece, sung in Latin as the film's second clue, with a chorus translating to a repeated call to find the Father's egg, or Easter egg. Technical notes cover a musical passage, indicating a return to the third beat with notes moving through B-flat, A-flat, and G. A friendly greeting takes place, with warm exchanges about being glad to see one another. Meeting Ernest Cline on the scoring stage felt fantastic, marked by a mutual sense of fanboy excitement. Excitement bursts out over a signed item, calling it incredible, and describing the moment as destiny, with appreciation expressed for a book gifted along with an inscription considered magnificent and now held in a place of honor at home. Gratitude is exchanged for the invitation, acknowledged as a first scoring session experience, alongside kindness shown in signing several Back to the Future vinyl scores that had been brought along. A request goes out for 3 autographs, met with an enthusiastic agreement to sign anything wanted, followed by expressions of thanks for the day and remarks about a heart nearly bursting with excitement. A brief acknowledgement that the moment has concluded gives way to an admission of having managed to maintain a calm, outward appearance while feeling, inwardly, like a little boy losing composure entirely. Difficulty comes through in imagining what it must be like for the author to have written the original material and then witnessed it rendered by the director, likely an overwhelming experience. A feeling is shared of the heart nearly leaping out of the chest, amazing by any account, and for a lifelong cinephile and film enthusiast, the day ranks among the greatest ever experienced. A brief question about whether the moment has ended leads into an explanation that the film was made out of love for the book, shared by many present, alongside an acknowledgement of also being a lifelong gamer, dating back to 1974 when a first Pong game was played on Martha's Vineyard during the filming of Jaws. The intention behind the film centers on wanting it to be both an adventure and a story about characters who meet within the oasis and become close friends. Making a movie from a book that became such a hit, created by a visionary with a grand imagination, feels wonderful, with hope expressed that the author has seen a version of the future that feels appreciated, respected, and validated. The experience overall amounts to more than a dream come true, surreal and wonderful at once. A farewell line addressed to a character named Parzival is followed by an expression of thanks, including gratitude for having played the game. A gathering takes place in an Austin, Texas home on March 5th, shortly before a movie premiere in the same town. Mention is made of moving to Austin in 1996 and attending South by Southwest and the Austin Film Festival ever since, along with 2 decades of moviegoing at the Paramount. Excitement builds around seeing Ready Player One screened for an Austin South by Southwest audience, with anticipation that it will be an enjoyable event. A text from the airport surfaces, describing a reaction upon seeing a face featured on the cover of a newly released movie tie-in book edition. The book has reached #1 on the New York Times bestseller list after previously sitting in the top 5, prompting surprise and congratulations. A flashback to 2 years earlier marks the first meeting between 2 collaborators and the first sighting of a DeLorean, occurring the night before a flight to London to begin filming at Leavesden Studios. Separate representatives had suggested a meeting since both parties were in Austin at the time. A drive around Austin followed, during which the DeLorean was handed over to be driven by the visiting party, making that person only the 3rd individual ever to drive the vehicle after a sibling. Surprise greeted the trust placed in someone preparing to portray Wade Watts. Having driven a real DeLorean provided helpful preparation for a motion capture sequence involving driving backwards to win a key, filmed using a stripped-down skeleton version of the car built for motion capture. An early attempt to turn around while filming revealed that nothing could be seen out the back of the vehicle due to the flux capacitor, requiring the door to be opened and a head stuck outside to see. 12 years earlier, on March 11th at South by Southwest, a first meeting occurred with a person who would go on to become a manager, credited with originating the idea for a race scene that eventually made it into the finished film. That same festival marked the first conversation about Ready Player One at a point when the book remained unfinished. Assistance was given in selling the book to a publisher, and within the following 48 hours, a bidding war over film rights emerged from the publishing world's interest, marking a life-changing period back in 2010. Amazement follows the realization that, 12 years later on that very same South by Southwest date, a return occurs with a Spielberg-directed adaptation of the same book. 3 years prior to this point, news arrived that the film would be directed by a major filmmaker, an outcome still difficult to fully process. Pre-production, meetings, filming, post-production, and visual effects work all followed, with the finished film already viewed and its public unveiling just a week away. A comment that the outcome is deserved meets modest deflection, though acceptance of the achievement is voiced regardless. The 2-week waiting period before learning of the director's involvement felt agonizing, filled with rewatching that filmmaker's earlier work and imagining the possibilities. Upon receiving confirmation, a celebratory drive around Austin in the DeLorean followed, with orchestral scores playing loudly, the best possible way to mark the occasion. A birthday falling on March 29th now appears on promotional materials, the coolest thing imaginable, with a joking remark that nothing could possibly top this moment going forward. A rehearsed line referencing possession of the copper key is practiced together as a shared moment. Reflection is offered on never having imagined a career in film, let alone contributing to a project directed by such a renowned filmmaker. 2 weeks of rehearsal preceded the director's arrival on the final day, marking a first meeting and an immediate request to capture footage despite a lack of preparation. Only one performer was needed for the moment, heightening the pressure felt. A private request followed to simply capture a walk, prompting a question about whether a distinctive Parzival walk had been practiced. Unfamiliarity with the term is admitted, followed by an explanation that the character possesses a swagger entirely unlike the character's real-world counterpart, with a suggestion to treat the two personas as separate, compared to a walk reminiscent of a well-known disco-era film. Standing on stage feeling notably nervous, a phone is produced and a well-known disco track begins playing. Approach is made while maintaining steady eye contact and nodding along to the music, followed by a call to begin the take. This moment stands as the very first instance of being directed by the filmmaker, occurring on the first day of production. A recommendation is recalled in which the whole cast was directed to watch a classic screwball comedy praised for its dialogue, particularly its rapid, overlapping exchanges. 2 performers specifically were instructed to study the dynamic between its lead actor and actress, noting a parallel to a garage scene in which 2 characters continually try to outdo one another, likened to the chemistry between 2 classic Hollywood stars. A trivia exchange follows regarding a character's favorite pop culture details, a favorite first-person shooter video game, played using a particular in-game character with a preferred multiplayer mode involving no weapons, a favorite racing game vehicle, a favorite food, a favorite restaurant, a favorite song, and a favorite music video. Genuine surprise greets how much of a big kid the filmmaker remains, retaining childlike enthusiasm for the craft of movie making. Watching the director and a cinematographer excitedly discuss a beloved horror classic and recreate its shots feels thrilling, especially having previously watched behind-the-scenes documentaries in which the same 2 figures discussed their admiration for that very film. Surprise also greets the seemingly boundless energy shown throughout production, with a suggestion that little sleep was had during filming. Enthusiastic engagement with any filmmaking question creates an ideal learning environment. A remark from another cast member describes the director as a towering figure who never makes others feel small, a sentiment affirmed as true, followed by a simple expression of thanks. Recognition as an authority on 1980s cinema comes through a personal garage collection and the ownership of a DeLorean, a defining passion by any measure. An invitation is extended to test this knowledge through a visual trivia challenge. A series of images is presented and correctly identified one after another. A science fiction comedy directed by Joe Dante, a flying car from a dystopian science fiction classic directed by Ridley Scott, a supernatural comedy, a dystopian film directed by Stanley Kubrick, an animated robot feature, and a science fiction drama involving artificial intelligence, noted as having always included its ending in Kubrick's original treatment before being completed by another director. Further images are identified as a pirate figure from a well-loved adventure film, a wartime drama credited as a story by the same acclaimed director, and a robotic companion character from the earlier artificial intelligence film, based on a short story about toys. A photograph of Kubrick directing prompts guesses eventually settling on the correct dystopian film, while another image points to a director known for a superhero film, an action comedy, and a coming-of-age adventure filmed in Oregon. A further photo is attributed to the same comedy director mentioned earlier, prompting guesses narrowed down correctly. A horror-themed section follows, acknowledged as a personal knowledge gap, correctly naming a franchise antagonist, but misidentifying the specific sequel entry as the fourth installment rather than the third, marked as the only incorrect answer. A final pair of images concerning a comedic monster franchise leads to an initial guess of the first film, followed by correction to the sequel subtitle. The trivia session concludes with a light-hearted apology directed at the director referenced throughout, followed by an invitation to further explore the DeLorean, which is accepted enthusiastically. Updates made to the vehicle since a previous visit get pointed out, including additions such as a flux capacitor, time circuits, and plutonium gauges, along with a modified glove box lid revealed to conceal a hidden storage cell. A well-known line about not needing roads is referenced alongside a nod to the film that inspired it. A sequel to the original novel is confirmed to be underway, with an offer made to share details once a door is closed for privacy. Muffled conversation follows, punctuated by an exclamation of disbelief and excitement. Readiness for a ride gets confirmed enthusiastically, followed by an exclamation of excitement as the drive begins, accompanied by a countdown before departure.